Welcome, welcome, film fans. Do you like horror movies? You know you do. Because today we're going to spend the lecture and the documentaries and the film clips on horror. You know, we missed it last week because of Halloween, but I'm making it up today, the day before Election Day. Horror show, as Alex from Clockwork Orange would say. We are in trying times, folks. That's why horror films are so popular right now. Do you like horror films? Do you avoid them? Do you seek them out? What do you like about them? What don't you like about them? Why do they matter? Well, we've had them since silent films. Some of the earliest silent films were horror films. A great one is Nosferatu, silent film. Another one would be Dr. Caligari's The Cabinet, Dr. Caligari, another silent horror film about a zombie murdering people. And then later on, and so they were making horror films in the silent era. We've always had a desire for horror, to be scared. Why do you think that is? Do you have any idea? Do you like to be scared? Do you avoid being scared? Do you ever watch a horror movie by yourself? Or do you always watch it with somebody else so you can kind of laugh at it? There's a great, I can't show it because we're not in class. If you know who Key and Peele is, the comedy group, where the guys just got done watching a horror movie and they come out and they're acting all like, oh, the horror didn't bother me at all. It was not even scary, but they're really terrified even to go to their own car in the parking lot. If I could find that clip, I'm going to show it to you on YouTube because it's not only funny, but it's also true. Let me just write that down. They put humor to it, and that even makes it more scary because you're laughing nervously. Skit. Okay. I remember in my other lifetime, I could scare the holy terror out of my girlfriend at the time. She was very easy to scare. We'd go somewhere, we'd get in the car, it'd be at night, and I'd be driving, and just for amusement, I would go, "Don't look in the back seat. Do not turn around. Don't look in the back seat." And she, of course, would turn around, look at the back seat. I just said, "Don't look in the back seat." She goes, "What are you doing? What did you?" I go, "I didn't see anything. Nothing's there. Don't worry about it." Now she knows I'm kidding, but I keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. Did you really check back there? Are you sure you checked back there? And I literally could bring her to tears. And then I go, "I'm just kidding, just joking." Me, oddly, me too. Anyway, so some people are very susceptible to the horrors of everyday life. It's horrible out there. It can be. Look what's going on in the country right now. We've got divisions. We've got a lot of violence going on, political violence caused by our political upheavals. And so now is a good time for horror films, for horror TV series, for horror. It's everywhere. In fact, I've never seen it so prevalent as I do now. In the 20s, they in the silent film they did have horror films. Some really wonderful ones that look so real. It's almost like you're seeing a real vampire if you watch Nosferatu. Really, it looks like a real vampire. And it's not our romantic notion of a vampire, of a guy in a cool looking dude with a suit and, is sexy. This guy is a little ferret. He's a little feral rat. He's got nothing is attractive about this guy. He is essentially a monster. And it's a very scary movie, even though it's made in the silent era. You can watch some film clips. If I can find them, I will show them to you on YouTube. You must watch them and enjoy it. In the 30s, the horror films kind of changed. They went to kind of monster films. Some people don't find those horrifying. Are they disturbing? Yes. Are they scary? I don't know. Maybe for a child they are. But they had The Mummy, Werewolf, Frankenstein's monster, Dracula. Those are all very popular in the 30s. When I talked about the 30s filmmaking, there's a reason why those monster movies were popular at the time. There was a monster brewing in Europe in the name of Adolf Hitler, and so our films reflected the terror of the day. We weren't fighting Hitler yet. That came later, but we could fight Dracula. We could fight Frankenstein's monster. We could fight the Mummy, or the Werewolf. We couldn't fight or defeat Hitler yet. That's going to be a lot of lives later, and another decade later. His day's coming, folks. Not yet. And during the 40s, wasn't so many horror films. They're kind of comedy horror films. Abbott Costello meets Frankenstein. Abbott Costello chases a ghost. They were kind of like tongue-in-cheek horror films. But there were some good ones. Cat People, coming from different countries. In the 50s, things changed in America because of we're in the Cold War now, and there was always this threat of the atomic bomb, which was a real threat. We had the bomb, and so did a communist Soviet Union, and we're always rattling our sabers at each other. And so there was a series of films usually through the decade, that address that. And they are usually in the form of a giant spider attacking a town, or ants in Them, which is a great horror film. And what are those things? Well, they're freaks of nature created by our experimenting with atomic power out in the desert. And a bunch of movies came out during this time of these creatures that were born out of nuclear experimentation. And they attack people. Attack of the 50-foot tall woman is exactly one of those. Anyway, so that was really popular. It was essentially a cautionary tale about how not to hopefully breathe atomic dust into your lungs, because you could turn into a giant crab. There was Attack of the Crab People. There are a giant spider. When I say giant, I'm talking about a spider as big as a truck. We're not talking about a little spider here. And then there was Japanese horror films of the 50s, like Godzilla, all because of nuclear testing that would get into the water, underwater, and affect underwater sea life. So that was really the most prevalent horror films of that era. Then there was paranoid films that were thinly disguised films about the communist threat. And those are horror films. And probably the best example of all would be Invasion of the Body Snatchers, made by the great Don Siegel, who went on and directed Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry and other movies. He was a great B-movie director. And his horror film was seminal. It's a low-budget film. You don't know all the actors who stars in it. I do, because I know these things, because I love these movies. But at the time, it was considered a B movie. A cautionary tale about aliens coming from outer space and sprinkling alien dust on people, and they turn into pods, like a big pea pod. And they eventually are hatched out, these pod people, and they have no emotion. And they look exactly like you do, but they don't feel love. They don't feel hate. They don't feel sorrow. They can't cry. They have no human emotion. That was supposed to be the new world. That was supposedly a thinly veiled um, um, threat from communism. If communism takes over, we will be pod people. We will be emotionless. We won't have any feelings. We will just be robots feeding the giant political machine, which was communism. And another one of those films, really excellent horror film, monster film, whatever you want to call it, was The Thing, the original Thing, not John Carpenter's remake, which is really a different take, and it's got a lot of grotesque special effects. The first one came out in about 1951, and really, really good B movie about aliens coming down here, and they attack a isolated uh, Air Force base at the very top of the world, the Arctic Circle, and or the North Pole, I think it is, and they take over. They take over. They kill people to live on their blood. And there's one alien who kind of looks like a giant carrot. That's right. Uh, who needs people's blood to keep living. And the people fight this thing. They're trapped in like a maze of warehouses in the North Pole. It's very, very, very cold, and there's no way to escape. They have to destroy this thing, but it's essentially a plant. So how do you destroy it? That's the problem. They can't shoot it because the bullets just go right through it. They can't cut. They can't stab it with a knife because it just grows back like a plant would if you stabbed it. But how they finally have to cook it with electricity, and that gets it. But it's a cautionary tale about communism and to be on the lookout for these aliens that are coming to change our way of life. And these are great sci-fi B movies, really well done, and they were cautionary tales of the Cold War we were experiencing at the time between us and Soviet Union. So those are popular 50s tales. Then we got into the 60s, and I mentioned last week, I made you guys hopefully watch the Roger Corman documentary. We're going to be talking about him a little bit later too when we do the quiz. And he made a series of Edgar Allan. He took Edgar Allan Poe's short stories and made a series of low budget films. The Raven, Pit and the Pendulum, and some of them starred the very young, very unknown Jack Nicholson. And he usually would get an old horror film actor from the 30s, like Boris Karloff, who was Frankenstein's monster, or John Carradine. I say Boris Karloff, yes, to play updated versions of themselves. So they're now in the twilight of their careers. They're like in their 60s. They're not so scary anymore. These movies aren't really scary, but they're very entertaining. Shot very econo, as they say, low budget. And they did well at the box office because they're for kids, young people who were going to drive-in movies. We mentioned that. I talked about that last week about the youth market and how brilliant Roger Corman, the director and producer, was capturing the youth market. He provided movies for the youth market, not just horror films, but I mentioned last week biker films, Hell's Angels films, which were really popular, like Wild Angels, later on Easy Rider. And then he also had teen beach party movies starring Annette Funicello and Frank Avalon. And they're all about teens having fun on the beach and surfing and sand. A little sex thrown in there, but always very safe. And a good time for kids. The youth market, we'll be talking about those films more so when we get closer to the quiz. And then the 70s was a scary time. We had the Vietnam War is raging. There's protests in the street. We have a president, Richard Nixon, who was not too honest, and he was being brought up on charges in Watergate. And there was the draft. So young men were getting drafted into the army and sent out to fight in Vietnam, a war they did not believe in. And lots of campus unrest in the colleges because of that. And rock and roll was protesting. We had, protests from Jimi Hendrix to the Beatles to Country Joe and the Fish and Joe Baez and Bob Dylan. We're all singing about how bad the war is, how you can't trust the government. That's all a good mix for horror. The civil rights is happening. Black people still don't have the civil rights that white people do. And the women's movement is happening. Feminism is starting to rear its beautiful head. And women were tired of not being treated like second-class citizens. And so there's all this big melting plot of the social atmosphere, the government, the distrust of the government, distrust of anybody old, anybody over 30, folks. That was the saying. And so it's a good time for some good horror movies. And along comes about 1973, and William Friedkin made probably maybe the most successful horror movie of all time, called The Exorcist. And it came right in the time of everybody's terrified about the world around them and paranoid about the world around them. And then here we have this story about a 12-year-old girl being possessed by Satan, folks. And let me tell you, have you seen The Exorcist? It came out in 73, and it blew everybody's mind because we never saw special effects like that. We never saw it was a child endangerment like that before. It's very graphic. The violence is graphic. The language is graphic. And it's really adult. And people who saw that movie, I was one of them, talked about it for years and had nightmares about it because it was that scary. Because unlike, say, Freddy or Michael Myers in a mask or somebody chasing you with a big knife, or the guy in Texas Chainsaw Massacre chasing you with a chainsaw, which is pretty horrifying, but at least it's a human being chasing you with an object of destruction. How do you fight Satan, folks? You can't even see the dude. And it possessed her body and her mind, and it twisted everybody's world upside down. And you came out of there feeling very vulnerable. And it was a huge box office success. Then later on, and earlier than that, there was Rosemary's Baby by Roman Polanski in 1968. And a lot of people thought he was actually evil. And that's why his wife, Sharon Tate, was murdered maybe by Charles Manson, because he directed a movie called Rosemary's Baby about Satan impregnating this woman to have his child. Pretty dark themes we're talking about here. Then later on, there's another film in the 70s called The Omen. For some reason, when there's an evil child, it's more scary than an evil adult because children are supposed to be innocent. And so there's good territory there for horror. And there was a lot of films coming out, Children of the Corn, and other things about children, the loss of innocence being taken over by evil. That's always a good theme. Not many horror films in the 80s to speak of. Later on, in the 90s, it became kind of hipster heaven for indie filmmakers, and they're making films like Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. Horrific, but not horror films. Then later on, early 2000s, there was the Blair Witch Project, which was a low budget film made for a couple $1,000. Maybe you've seen it, and it was so popular. This low budget film made with unknown actors, shot on videotape, but they sold it. They sold it. It was a big hit at Sundance, and they sold it for a lot of money. So all of a sudden, horror was kind of back in fashion again, and so there was there was a trend now that you can make low budget horror films and make a lot of money in Hollywood. There was a production company called Miramax, and there was two brothers. Harvey Weinstein, maybe you've heard of him. He's the guy that just got convicted of rape, and he's serving a 20-year sentence. And his brother ran the horror genre of Miramax, and they produced films like the first Scream, low budget with maybe actors you don't know that well. They made a lot of money. So the appetite for horror's always been there. I want you guys to think about that when you're going to write your essay next. Why? Why? So think about horror films now. We have lots of vampire movies. We're still fascinated with vampires. One of my favorite ones is called Near Dark, made by Kathy Bigelow, came out in the late 80s. But there's been other really good vampire movies. Jim Jarmusch, one of my favorite filmmakers, made one about 3 years ago called Only Lovers Left, about two vampires who were totally in love with each other, and they're living on synthetic blood. They don't want to murder or hurt anybody. They just want to live their lives. They're hundreds of years old. And of course, things get scary when their blood supply runs out and they've got to go back to their old-fashioned ways. Near Dark, what people don't understand about vampires mostly is they have to drink human blood every day to stay alive. That's what keeps them going. How do you do that? Well, you have to murder somebody every single day. Think about that, folks. When you want to be a vampire, because you like the idea of staying up all night and wearing cool clothes, but you have to murder somebody every day and drain their blood. You have to drink it. That's what keeps you immortal. Now, say if you're living in a small town, how are you going to murder somebody and get away with it every day? That's a lot of murdering going on, folks. That's one murder a day, every day. And so you will probably get found out eventually. Someone's going to investigate and find out. And so it's not easy being a vampire and getting away with it. And so Kathy Bigelow really, in Near Dark, she dealt with that issue. These people were renegades. They're on the move all the time. They never lived in one place. They traveled from town to town, and they would go into a bar and kill everybody in the bar, drink all their blood, and they'd be gone. And so there's always this mass carnage, but the people who did it are always down the road. So it wasn't easy to find them. So the myth of vampirism changed over the years from, like, say, the Bela Lugosi early 30s vampires, or, Bram Stoker's story. It changed with a book called Interview with a Vampire, which they made into a pretty decent movie with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, of all people. Yes, folks, they're vampires. Sexy vampires. Nice long flowing hair. But they had a murder every day, just like all the other vampires. So there's the trade-off. So those have always been popular, and they still are. It's in our urban myth, vampires. Some rock musicians, goth musicians, kind of play up that that aspect of their music and their lives and the way they dress. The nocturnal aspect is attractive. I'm a nocturnal person. I like it when it's dark. Um, I come up with more creative ideas than when it's light. Am I a vampire? No. I have a desire to drink blood or to kill anybody. Anyway, so now what's really popular also in the modern culture are zombies. They're everywhere. They're on television, they're on movies, zombie apocalypse, The Walking Dead. Why? So when you're looking at this essay I'm going to assign to you, I want you to look at that question, why? Why is horror so popular in our culture? Then what you have to do, what I want you to do is critically think about what's going on in the world. Like right now, we've got a pandemic going on. We've got political upheaval like we've never had before. We've got angry people. We've got Black Lives Matter. We got all sorts of stuff to make a nice stew for a horror movie, for a zombie movie. And so it's easily relatable. And I think that's where horror taps into the relatability that's in all of us. And recently, there's been a couple of really excellent, smart horror films by Peele, from Key and Peele. He directed his first movie called Get Out. Maybe you've seen it. It's a horror film with some humor because he's a humorist also, and it made a boatload of money, something $200-300 million. That means he's going to get to make a lot more movies. Essentially, it's about a white girl who's dating a African American boy, and she takes him home to meet the affluent white privileged parents who seem to be good liberal parents, but guess what? They're not good at all. They drug the black guys that she brings home as their boyfriends, and they turn them into their own slaves. That's not nice, folks. So it's got a political aspect to it with a lot of humor and real horror. Maybe you've seen it. He directed a movie that came out last year called what's this other movie called? Come on, it came out. Us. Yeah. And that's about people, and they have their identical twin, and the identical and scary shit goes on when you have somebody who's identical to you. These aren't natural twins, folks, that are born. They're doppelgangers, but they're evil. Anyway, so he's tapped into the zeitgeist of our modern culture. That's why his films are popular. They're smart, well directed, well acted, and there's humor in there and true horror. It's like your worst nightmare. So those are hugely budgeted, popular movies. He's producing TV now, the new Twilight Zone series and other things. And but before that, I want to talk briefly about a movie that is an excellent horror film called The Haunting. They've remade it several times. It's based on a Shirley Jackson novel called The Haunting of Hill House. I just noticed they've rebooted it up for another TV series. I think it's called The Haunting of Some Other House, but it's based on her book. And this movie came out in '65, and it's got some horrible, scary scenes in it, but there's no blood in it. There's no monsters in it. They're in a scary, haunted house. And when I saw this movie, I was about 12 years old. It scared the bejesus out of me. I had nightmares of that film forever. That's how powerful it was. Directed by Robert Wise, who had, believe it or not, directed The Sound of Music like the year before. And he directed this next. I got to meet him when I lived in Santa Fe. He was also the editor on Orson Welles' film, The Magnificent Ambersons and Citizen Kane. And he directed some amazing movies. He directed a great sci-fi film called The Day the Earth Stood Still. Excellent film. He didn't stay to one genre. He did them all. I don't think he ever did a Western, though. But maybe, I don't think he did. Anyway, but his Hill House is truly frightening. Would you go spend a weekend in a haunted house if you knew it was haunted? Yes or no? If you went there, would you go there by yourself? Can we think about horrible things without them being real? You know you can. Let me just ask you this: when you were a kid, even now maybe, were you scared to look under your bed at night? Because there's always a monster underneath your bed. You know that. Were you scared to look into your closet at night, or did you shut the door and leave it shut? Who here slept with their closet door open? Did you have a closet? I hope you did. Nobody does. Because every primal fear we have usually takes place in bed. When we're sleeping, we're at our most vulnerable. Look at Freddy's Nightmare, Nightmare on Elm Street. Have you seen it? You have to fall asleep. If you fall asleep, Freddy will get you. If you don't fall asleep, you're fine. In Invasion of the Potty Snatchers, if you fall asleep, you will be taken over by a pod. And so they spend the whole movie trying to stay awake. Now that's primal, folks, because we all need to go to sleep. And you're going to have to close your eyes, even if it's 5 minutes, eventually. And if you do that in Nightmare on Elm Street, you're doomed. How many of you, when you were children, if your arm fell out of the bed and was hanging out there by itself, no covers on it, how many left your arm out there, dangling, for anything to touch it, anything to attack you? How many do you do that? Who leaves their arms out now as adults? Does it still give you eerie feelings? Maybe. Do you pull your hand back in? Why do we feel safer with the covers on top of us? Do you think that's actually going to save you? They're just sheets. They're just the down comforter. How is that going to save you from a real live threat? But many, many, many of our horror films, The Exorcist is one of them, she's in bed the whole time. So actually, beds have a connotation that something evil could take place in the bed when you're most vulnerable, when you're trying to sleep and have peaceful dreams. Think again. Anyway, I hope you guys had an interesting Halloween. You got some candy, I hope, or gave some out. It's a different world we're living in now with the pandemic. I feel sorry for the kids. They're not as free as they used to be. Hopefully this all goes away eventually. We've got 2 more essays, this one here and next one next week. And then we're going to do a quiz in about 2 weeks from a documentary we're all going to watch. Keep up on your journals because you're going to need to hand that in. And then you're going to do one final paper, a research paper. You can start thinking about it now. You can write on any aspect in cinema, anything. A director, a movie, a screenwriter, a cinematographer, a movie, a genre. But here's the thing. Please run it by me before you do so I can approve it. So give me a text and say, this is John from Human 4 class. I want to write about John Wayne. We'll talk about this more in detail lately. It's not an essay, it's a research paper, which is going to be different than these essays I've been signing. So I'm going to sign another paper today. Look forward to assignments. It'll be about horror films. I'll probably give you a couple choices of some films to watch and to critically analyze. Sorry if they charge you a fee. I'm trying to find the ones that don't. Like last time, I lucked out and found both of your films on the waterfront and Persona on Canopy, which doesn't cost you anything. It costs a school somewhat, but they're there for to pay for it. Anyway, students, go out there, watch a scary movie. Let's see if you watch it by yourself or not. And then go to bed. Shut off all the lights. Don't use a light. Let's see how you feel about it. Do you watch a scary movie before you go to bed? Do you really? Prove it. On that note, remember, everything is cinema.